The 9,300th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is threats to international peace and security. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with the Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Belarus, Estonia, Poland, and Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with the Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu, High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with the Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite His Excellency, Mr. Olaf Skog, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu. You have the floor, Madam.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council. On 25th of March, the Russian Federation announced that it has reached an agreement with Belarus to station its non-strategic nuclear weapons in Belarusian territory. When it comes to issues related to nuclear weapons, I wish to be clear at the outset. All states must avoid taking any actions that could lead to escalation, mistake, or miscalculation. All states parties to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, or the NPT, nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states alike, must strictly adhere to the commitments and obligations they have assumed under the treaty. Fulfillment of these commitments and obligations is an essential element of preventing the spread and use of nuclear weapons and in bringing about their elimination. It is at the core of the maintenance of international peace and security. The elimination of nuclear weapons remains the highest disarmament priority of the United Nations and a goal to which all United Nations member states remain committed. The issue of the hosting by a non-nuclear weapon state of a nuclear weapon state's nuclear weapons is one that has existed for decades across various regions and under different arrangements. These arrangements predate the NPT, with the exception of the recent announcement. The issue of so-called nuclear sharing was debated intensely during the negotiation of the NPT. It has been the subject of subsequent discussions, including at NPT review conferences. States parties have taken different positions and interpretations on the issue of nuclear sharing, and those positions are well known to all and recorded in the summaries of various review conferences. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, the risk of a nuclear weapon being used is currently higher than at any time since the depth of the Cold War. The war in Ukraine represents the most acute example of that risk. The absence of dialogue and the erosion of the disarmament and arms control architecture, combined with dangerous rhetoric and veiled threats, are key drivers of this potentially existential risk. So I would like to repeat, states must avoid taking any actions that could lead to escalation, mistake, or miscalculation. They should return to dialogue to de-escalate tensions urgently and find ways to develop and implement transparency and confidence-building measures. For the sake of all our security, I echo the Secretary General's call for the Russian Federation and the United States to return to full implementation of the New START Treaty and commence negotiations on its successor. The accelerated implementation of commitments under the NPT can also contribute to undergirding international stability. I therefore appeal to all states parties of the NPT to fully adhere to their obligations to the treaty and to immediately engage in serious efforts to reduce nuclear risk and de-escalate tensions. I thank you very much for your attention.
I thank Ms. Nakamitsu for our briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Ms. Nakamitsu, for your remarks. Colleagues, Russia's latest provocative announcement of its intention to transfer tactical nuclear weapons to another country, Belarus, would be troubling news at any time. But given the war of aggression it is relentlessly pursuing in Ukraine, it translates into a clear and irresponsible threat. After placing nuclear weapons on war alert in February 2022, engaging in deterrent exercises in October 2022, the suspension of obligations under the New START Treaty last February, The latest statement is unfortunately coherent with the current irresponsible policy of Russia in its persistent, stubborn course to continue threatening its neighbors and further endanger regional and global stability. Mr. President, stating that Russia does not respect agreements and commitments has become just an understatement. It has shown that it doesn't respect the UN Charter, and for it, international law is optional only if it suits its ambitions. Most egregious among many is the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, but since February 2022, Russia has violated countless pieces of international law and Security Council resolutions and continues to disregard a direct call by the ICJ to hold its invasion in Ukraine. It is now undermining the nuclear disarmament architecture and the international security system in general. Mr. President, Belarus, which has already served in full complicity as a base for Russian troops during the attack on Ukraine, is now preparing to receive Russian tactical nuclear weapons in its territory. It will be for the citizens of Belarus to evaluate if this reversal in the Russian nuclear policy will make them more secure or just turn their country into a nuclear hostage, becoming more and more a Russian appendix. Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya, the winner of the last elections and leader of the democratic forces of Belarus, has qualified this act an act against the will of the people and one that undermines the sovereignty of Belarus. But beyond what this may mean for the sovereignty and the future of Belarus, this constitutes another unnecessary and unjustified irresponsible behavior meant to scare, to instill fear primarily among the European public. The justification provided by Belarus that it needs such weapons to protect itself against NATO is just laughable. Mr. President, threatening with apocalypse, as Kremlin is so fond of, is always dangerous and unsettling. But yielding the nuclear threat seems to have become the Russian joker every time they are stalled on the ground. Failing to have anything worth in terms of success to announce and feed their nationalist flamethrowers, picking up on the nuclear threats looks like the painkiller at hand. After all, the terrifying prospect of nuclear war easily and understandably overshadows the painful reality of thousands of body bags returning home, of mothers crying for their missing sons, of the soldiers complaining on social media about the unfit condition they found themselves in, or the voices of reason which end up in prison. Like the 13-year-old girl, Maria, who finds herself in forced childcare, separated from her father, who was convicted to 2 years in prison for an innocent drawing of his child. As we know, threatening with the fears of nuclear conflict, which is precisely what Russia is doing, undermines the basis and principles of the Treaty of the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the nuclear disarmament architecture, and the international security system as a whole. It brings back the mentality of the Cold War through nuclear blackmailing. It is as wrong as the unlawful illegal transfer of the Iranian killing drones or the illegal transfer of weapons from North Korea. Colleagues, be they tactical or strategic, nuclear weapons are all deadly, weapons of mass destruction that should never be used. Let's remind ourselves of the declaration of the leaders of the 5 nuclear states not too long ago, in January 2022, stating that a nuclear war cannot be won and it must never be fought. But the same declaration also underlines the shared desire, and I quote, to work with all states to create a security environment more conducive to progress on disarmament with the ultimate goal of a world without nuclear weapons with undiminished security for all, end of quote. Well, that desire seems to have vanished in Russia since, with their action, they are not working for disarmament, but to the contrary, they are contributing to proliferation, which contradicts its role as a permanent member of the Security Council. Mr. President, we reiterate our firm condemnation of the ongoing war, which is wrong, unjust, and unjustifiable. We reiterate our call for the war to stop immediately. But until then, our collective efforts to deal with the consequences of this aggression must continue. Our determination to help Ukraine defend itself must not weaken, and we must stay firm in our resolve to hold into account those who commit crimes and threaten the world with nuclear weapons. we express our full solidarity with Ukraine and the admirable resilience of its people who deserve no less than to live in freedom in their country, by their choosing, in their territory, within their internationally recognized borders. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I thank the High Representative for her informative and sobering briefing this morning. It is unfortunate that this meeting was necessary today, but President Putin is escalating Russia's dangerous and destabilizing behavior by now threatening to deploy nuclear weapons in Belarus. He has once again reminded the world of his disregard for international law, including the UN Charter. Russia's suggestion that this intended deployment is somehow justified because of the use of armor-piercing ammunition is ludicrous. To state the obvious, armor-piercing ammunition is in no way analogous to tactical nuclear weapons. Viewing the Kremlin's announcement in the context of the totality of Russia's behavior, it becomes quite clear that this announcement has nothing to do with an ammunition type, one that has, by the way, been in use for decades and that Russia itself possesses. Rather, it has everything to do with the Kremlin's attempts to limit and deter international security assistance for Ukraine's defense of its sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. The reality is the Kremlin doesn't want Ukraine to possess the capability to defend itself against Russia's tanks. But let us recall a simple, immutable fact: Russia's tanks would not come into contact with these armor-piercing munitions if Russia's tanks were not within Ukraine's sovereign territory in the first place. It would not be necessary to supply Ukraine with defensive weapons and equipment if Russia had not launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And now, through completely irresponsible rhetoric and continued disinformation, Russia seeks to escalate its unprovoked and brutal war against Ukraine rather than to seek peace. President Putin's March 25th announcement, noting intentions to forward deploy nuclear weapons to Belarus, is not about nuclear burden sharing. There are no credible defense-related reasons for Russia to station nuclear weapons in Belarus. Lukashenko continues to provide material and logistical support to Russia's military, and for months has parroted Russia's irresponsible and false narrative of provocation. The Lukashenko regime paved the way for Putin's decision on March 25 by enacting a series of constitutional changes in February 2022 against the will of most Belarusians to enable Russia's stationing of nuclear weapons in Belarus. Indeed, Russia appears willing to break its promises whenever it suits President Putin's interests. Less than a fortnight ago, President Putin committed in a joint statement with China to effectively reduce the risk of nuclear war, and cynically stated that, and I quote, "Nuclear weapon states should refrain from deploying nuclear weapons abroad and withdraw nuclear weapons deployed abroad," end of quote. Putin's continued disregard for his promises to his friends for Russia's international obligations and commitments, and his willingness to sacrifice strategic stability to achieve his goals in Ukraine is a risk to this Council's agenda regarding the maintenance of international peace and security. It was Russia's decisions that led to the termination of the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in 2019. Through its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia has further contravened its commitments under the 1994 Budapest Memorandum. Last year, it was Russia, and Russia alone, that decided to block consensus on a final document at the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty Review Conference. Since then, Russia has strayed even further from implementation of its arms control obligations, with its purported suspension of participation in the 2010 New Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, New START. Not only was this legally invalid, but it demonstrates an increasingly disturbing trend of Russia's reliance on nuclear weapons and provocative nuclear rhetoric to intimidate those prepared to help Ukraine provide for its legitimate self-defense. The Kremlin is attempting to manipulate the specter of nuclear conflict to help win its illegal war against Ukraine, while it further tramples on the UN Charter. In the face of these violations, it is unfortunate that some on this Council have chosen a policy of ignoring Russia's aggression against the Ukrainian people. By refusing to acknowledge Russia's dangerous actions or condemn its violation of the principles of the UN Charter, those who have chosen this path enable further violations by Russia, exacerbating the conflict and moving us all further away from peace by turning a blind eye to the cause of this conflict, which is Russia's armed invasion of Ukraine. No legitimate path to peace can stem from a refusal to recognize the facts. No other country is inflicting such damage on arms control nor seeking to undermine strategic stability in Europe. No other country has raised the prospect of potential nuclear use in connection with the war in Ukraine. No other country is increasing nuclear deployments in Europe or issuing implied threats of use. No country is threatening Russia or threatening President Putin. Putin's war against Ukraine is one he never should have started and one the Kremlin could end in a moment if it chooses. That it deliberately chooses not to is telling, as are the actions of those who would criticize Ukraine for defending its sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence. In light of the international community's overwhelming support for peace, as demonstrated by last month's General Assembly vote on a just and lasting peace, we call on Russia to reconsider its intentions to forward deploy nuclear weapons to Belarus and once again call on Russia to withdraw its troops from Ukraine. Russia should immediately cease escalatory rhetoric around the potential use of nuclear weapons. Any use of chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons in Ukraine would have severe consequences for the maintenance of international peace and security and would fundamentally change the nature of this war. And any use of nuclear weapons would break the record of non-use of such weapons that is held for nearly 80 years. We also call on the Lukashenko regime to cease its complicity in Russia's war against Ukraine. And we again call on Russia to de-escalate, starting with the cessation of its war of aggression against Ukraine. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Monsieur le Président, nous vous remercions d'avoir convoqué cette réunion. Nous remercions également le secrétaire général adjointe, Madame Izumi Nakamitsu, pour son exposé. La Suisse prend note avec inquiétude de l'annonce selon laquelle la Russie entend déployer des armes nucléaires au Bélarus. De telles déclarations sont troublantes, d'autant plus vraies que lorsqu'elles émanent d'une partie à un conflit armé international et concrètement de la Russie lors de son agression militaire contre l'Ukraine. Si la Russie devait mettre en place un système de partage nucléaire, ce développement viendrait contredire ces condamnations répétées de cette pratique, y compris lors de la 10e conférence d'examen du traité sur la non-prolifération des armes nucléaires TNP. L'annonce faite soulève également des questions concernant les engagements pris dans le contexte du TNP, notamment en vue d'appliquer des mesures conduisant au désarmement nucléaire, y inclut la réduction et l'élimination de ce type d'armes. Tous les États dotés de l'arme nucléaire sont tenus de faire progresser le désarmement et de réduire les risques nucléaires. En outre, nous appelons également le Bélarus à faire preuve de responsabilité et à s'abstenir d'accueillir ces armes sur son territoire. Toute utilisation d'armes nucléaires aurait des conséquences humanitaires catastrophiques et risquerait une escalade incontrôlée. Que ce soit intentionnellement, à cause de mauvais calculs, de malentendus ou d'un accident, toute escalade de cette nature doit être évitée. La Suisse appelle tous les États dotés de l'arme nucléaire à réduire leur rôle dans les doctrines militaires et de sécurité. Nous condamnons tout type de menace nucléaire proférée par la Russie dans le cadre de son agression militaire contre l'Ukraine. Nous avons tous une responsabilité partagée de préserver le TNP en tant que pierre angulaire du régime international de désarmement et de non-prolifération nucléaire qui est fondamental pour parvenir à un monde exempt de telles armes. Monsieur le Président, je saisis cette occasion pour réitérer la préoccupation de la Suisse quant à l'érosion continue du système de contrôle d'armes nucléaires. Nous nous inquiétons de la décision de la Russie de suspendre sa participation au New START. nous constatons désormais l'annonce faite par les États-Unis visant à limiter les notifications de leur côté. La Suisse appelle les parties à redoubler d'efforts en vue de conclure un nouvel accord avant l'expiration, en 2026, de ce dernier traité bilatéral portant sur les armes nucléaires. Nous appelons tous les États à œuvrer au désarmement nucléaire ainsi qu'à la réduction de risques liés aux armes nucléaires et à réaffirmer et renforcer le rôle de ce Conseil et sa responsabilité. Dans ce contexte, nous rappelons la déclaration commune des membres permanents du Conseil de début 2022, selon laquelle une guerre nucléaire ne peut être gagnée et ne doit jamais être menée. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Gabon.
Monsieur le Président, je remercie la haute représentante Izumi Nakamitsu pour son exposé. Nous sommes particulièrement préoccupés par les récentes informations concernant le déploiement par la Russie d'armes nucléaires tactiques en Biélorussie, un mois après la suspension de sa participation au traité nucléaire bilatéral New START. Ces informations se croisent avec celles relatives aux livraisons massives d'armes à l'Ukraine. À l'évidence, nous nous trouvons devant un tournant dangereux de la guerre dans lequel l'utilisation de l'arme nucléaire apparaît de plus en plus comme une option. Qu'elle serve de dissuasion ou qu'elle soit mise au service de la propagande des belligérants, la rhétorique du recours au nucléaire fait redouter le pire pour le monde entier et singulièrement pour les populations en proie au conflit qui continuent d'en payer le prix le plus fort. Monsieur le Président, ces développements vont à l'encontre des objectifs internationaux de désarmement et de non-prolifération nucléaire prescrits par le TNP. Ils constituent également un recul quant aux efforts visant à rendre le monde plus sûr en éradiquant la menace nucléaire, ainsi qu'un signal contradictoire et difficile à interpréter à l'endroit des États non dotés d'armes nucléaires. Par-dessus tout, cette tendance à la banalisation de l'arme nucléaire et à l'exhibition de la force est périlleuse pour notre humanité. L'histoire très récente parle d'elle-même sur les ravages de cette catégorie d'armes dont les conséquences horribles sont irréparables. Mon pays ne soutiendra jamais l'emploi ou la menace d'emploi d'armes nucléaires, ni aucune arme de destruction massive. Nous réitérons notre opposition à cette guerre absurde qui a assez duré. Après 13 mois de combats meurtriers et destructeurs, ce Conseil doit être l'épicentre d'idées nouvelles sur la manière d'en sortir, sur les perspectives concrètes de négociation et sur un engagement des parties pour faire taire les armes et ramener la paix et la sécurité en Ukraine. Mon pays réitère son appel aux belligérants à respecter le droit international et à s'abstenir de toute logique outrancière qui tend à faire perdurer la guerre. Il est insoutenable d'amplifier les traumatismes en continuant à agiter les épouvantails de la destruction. Les canaux de la diplomatie doivent supplanter les paris hasardeux de la force brutale et la coexistence pacifique doit prévaloir à la logique de l'affrontement. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of Gabon for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
主席先生，我首先要感谢中版权高级代表的通报。核武器是悬在人类头上的达摩克里斯之剑。中方在核武器问题上的立场是明确的、一贯的。从拥有核武器的第一天起，中方即坚定奉行自卫防御的核战略，始终恪守在任何时候和任何情况下都不首先使用核武器的承诺。中方并明确承诺，无条件不对无核武器国家和无核武器区使用或威胁使用核武器。 中国是唯一做出上述承诺的核武器国家。中方高度重视不扩散核武器条约在国际核裁军与核不扩散领域的基石地位，坚定维护条约的权威性、有效性和普遍性，主张循序渐进推进核裁军进程，主张最终全面禁止和彻底销毁核武器，呼吁废除核共享安排，主张所有核武器国家都不应在境外部署核武器，并应撤出在境外部署的核武器。大国互信与协作是维护全球战略稳定的根本保障。去年1月，5核国领导人发表联合声明，强调核战争打不赢也打不得，重申不将核武器瞄准彼此或其他任何国家。在当前核武器国家关系紧张的背景下，这一历史性声明的特殊重要意义更加凸显。中方呼吁所有核武器国家遵循声明理念，切实降低核战争风险，避免核武器国家间爆发任何武装冲突。主席先生，中方在乌克兰问题上的立场也是明确的、一贯的。不久前，中方发布关于政治解决乌克兰危机的中国立场文件，全面阐述了中方立场主张。这其中就包括反对武装攻击核电站等和平核设施，强调核武器用不得，核战争打不得，反对使用或威胁使用核武器，防止核扩散，避免出现核危机等方面的内容。最近发生的一系列事态，再次证明，重启对话谈判，推动政治解决，宜早不宜迟。所有各方均应保持理性、克制，不加剧紧张，不激化矛盾，不拱火浇油，停止一切促使战事延宕的举动，避免危机进一步恶化，甚至失控。国际社会应当增强劝和促谈的紧迫感，为早日重启谈判创造条件。中方将继续为停火止战、缓解危机、恢复和平发挥建设性的作用。谢谢主席。
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President, and I also thank High Representative Nakamitsu. Thank you for your clear and sobering briefing today on this important issue. President, at the outset, I want to insist on Malta's unwavering commitment to nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament, and to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which remains the cornerstone of the nuclear non-proliferation regime. We are convinced that this is the only path to follow if we want to secure peace and prosperity and a safer future for all. There are no winners in a nuclear war. We will all be losers in such a confrontation, and the devastating humanitarian consequences and environmental fallout would be felt for generations to come. Malta strongly condemns any nuclear threats or dangerous nuclear rhetoric. Such acts undermine the vital role of the global non-proliferation regime and the tragic consequences that would result from a nuclear detonation. As members of the international community, we have a responsibility to make sure that a nuclear war is never fought. Since the beginning of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, just over a year ago, the world has held its breath as Russia conducts reckless military activity within and around civilian nuclear facilities in Ukraine, and continues to occupy Europe's larger nuclear power plant in Zaporizhzhia, creating a significant risk of a radiological incident. For over a year, international peace and security has been threatened as the world has been subjected to an unacceptable Russian nuclear threat against its neighbor, an independent, sovereign, non-nuclear weapon state that voluntarily gave up the nuclear arsenal left on its territory almost 30 years ago. Ukraine did this in good faith and in exchange for security assurances from Russia, assurances which have been betrayed. Furthermore, just a few weeks ago, Russia declared that it was suspending its participation in the New START Treaty, the last remaining nuclear arms control agreement with the United States. Such actions threaten millions of civilians in Ukraine, the region, and beyond. Needless to say, the devastating humanitarian and environmental consequences of nuclear weapons would not be confined within national borders or the European continent. The war is already having ramifications on global food security, which we are trying to contain by means of a fragile mechanism. We can only begin to imagine the multiplier effect and catastrophic consequences if nuclear weapons are added to the equation. Also, let us not forget that the vast majority of states, including many developing countries, have fought hard to make progress on nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. Instead, we have been plunged back into a situation where a nuclear disaster is within the realm of possibility. President, at the start of 2022, the 5 permanent members of this Council, including the Russian Federation, reiterated their important declaration that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. Russia's reckless nuclear rhetoric contradicts this declaration. We urge Belarus to fully understand the consequences and repercussions of its actions should it choose to accommodate Russia's plans. We stress the fact that the storage or deployment of Russian nuclear weapons in Belarus would raise nuclear tensions, gravely compromise international peace and security, increase the risk of a nuclear accident or miscommunication, and drastically increase the possibility of an escalation to nuclear war. Such risks are unacceptable. They should never be considered, let alone taken. President, our discussion today is yet another direct and dreadful consequence of Russia's illegal, unjustified, and unprovoked war against Ukraine. Once again, Malta reiterates its call on the Russian Federation to immediately cease its war of aggression and withdraw all its forces from Ukraine's internationally recognized borders. At this juncture, the last thing we should do is raise the stakes even higher. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And thank you, High Representative Nakamitsu, for your sobering briefing. As others have said, President, in January 2020, the leaders of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council said that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. They also said that nuclear weapons, for as long as they continue to exist, should serve defensive purposes, deter aggression, and prevent war. Despite this commitment, since the beginning of Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, President Putin has used irresponsible nuclear rhetoric. Let us be clear. No other country has raised the prospect of nuclear use in this conflict. No one is threatening Russia's sovereignty. It is Russia who has violated the UN Charter by invading another sovereign country. President Putin's announcement on March 25th is his latest attempt to intimidate and coerce. This has not worked and will not work. We will continue to support Ukraine to defend itself. We have heard President Putin's claim that the trigger for this announcement is the UK supplying depleted uranium munitions to Ukraine alongside Challenger tanks, as it defends itself in accordance with Article 51 of the UN Charter. Russia is well aware that this is conventional ammunition, not nuclear munitions. This is yet another example of them deliberately trying to mislead. We welcome President Xi's call for the international community to jointly oppose the use or threats to use nuclear weapons. And I listened carefully to our Chinese colleague today. We also note the Chinese and Russian joint statement that nuclear weapons should not be deployed abroad. Despite these statements of intent, Russia has steadily undermined the arms control architecture underpinning our collective security. Russia's persistent violations of the INF Treaty resulted in the treaty's collapse in 2019. And this year, Russia suspended its participation in New START. President Lukashenko has made no secret of his wish to see Russia-based nuclear weapons in Belarus. We urge him to stop enabling Russia's reckless and escalatory actions. We will stand firm in our support to the people of Ukraine and call on Russia to de-escalate. It should start by ceasing its illegal and unprovoked invasion. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Mr. President, I would like to begin by thanking High Representative Izumi Nakamitsu for attending to the Council this morning and for the clarity of the briefing provided. During all previous meetings of the Council on Ukraine, Ghana has been consistent in underlining the necessity for the Russian Federation to end its assault on the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine as a basis for seeking a political solution to the conflict. We reiterate our principled position that the ongoing aggression constitutes a serious violation of international law and contradicts the prohibition against the use of force under Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the United Nations Charter. Mr. President, as the war in Ukraine rages with no immediate end in sight, the humanitarian toll, which has largely been characterized by forced displacements and the death of thousands, keep compounding. We remain concerned by the horrifying destruction of civilian infrastructure, including schools and hospitals, resulting from military hostilities, and reiterate our strong condemnation of all such deliberate attacks on civilians and critical infrastructure. We renew our reminder to the warring parties that they have an obligation to respect international humanitarian law and international human rights law, and further draw attention to the consequences of accountability that violations entail. While the Ukrainian people have primarily borne the brunt of the brutal war, the repercussions of the war is reverberating far beyond the borders of their country. For many countries in the global south, there is great concern over the present state of affairs and the lack of capacity of the global economic system to respond to their overwhelming needs, which they have in their societies. As we meet, it is imperative to acknowledge that the ongoing war is undermining relations between states and creating disruptive and undesirable consequences. We must therefore redouble our efforts to get the warring parties to the table of dialogue and diplomacy, including by supporting every potential green shoot for peace. Mr. President, the strategic risks arising from deliberate actions or miscalculations from the Ukraine war are real and should not be discounted. As a country, we have always stood against the possession of nuclear weapons and oppose emerging strategic doctrines for modernization of arsenals, tactical use of nuclear weapons, and all such modifying measures by nuclear weapon possessing states. All of us should be aware of the danger that arises when we blur the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons and the abyss it can drive the world into. We must pull back and change course. Accordingly, we urge the protagonists and all actors to exercise maximum restraint and remain mindful of their disarmament commitments and nuclear non-proliferation obligations. It should not be lost on anyone that nuclear non-proliferation regime, which counts as one of the cornerstones of the present global security and peace architecture, requires an oxygen of good faith, dialogue, trust, and confidence building to thrive. Mr. President, our concern continues to deepen over the mobilization of massive military and other strategic assets to engage in a greater war. As we have stated before and strongly repeat today, The projections of the military logic as the basis for the settlement of this conflict portend great difficulties. We continue to advocate for the peaceful settlement of the dispute through the pursuit of negotiations on the basis of the Charter and international law. We note serious ongoing engagements to bring the parties around some principles for a mediation effort and encourage the constructive engagement of the parties. We would also encourage all countries that are able to exert positive influence on the warring parties to urge them to refrain from repudiating prospective peace initiatives and proposals. In concluding, Ghana reaffirms a deep commitment to the sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. We reiterate our solidarity with the people of Ukraine and offer them our support for a hopeful peace effort. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ghana for their statement. I now give the floor to Russian Federation.
President, we thank the High Representative Izumi Nakamitsu for her briefing. Today, we've heard a number of critical observations against our country. There's a general logic of our former Western partners here. The logic is that Russia is responsible for all of the ills of today's world. We're not surprised by that, but we're talking about serious matters here, matters that bear on the security of our entire planet. So, allow us to provide some explanations of who is truly posing a threat to peace and stability. Incidentally, we were struck by the reference to Svetlana Ikhanovskaya about the chief of staff of Belarus, United Cabinet of Belarus, about the so-called leader of democratic forces of Belarus. We could just, with the same success, point to the opinion of Guaido. We believe that that would be no less authoritative in this hall. President, recent years have seen the global security architecture subject to serious erosion. What began under U.S. initiative and the initiative of their allies, those that proclaim themselves to be the victors in the Cold War, the process of the destruction and dismantling of key arms control agreements and confidence-building structures. This process was systematic and consistent, and it was not provoked by any acts by our country. These steps were dictated exclusively by the aspirations of the U.S. to cement their own geopolitical domination and to stand in the way of the objective process of emergence of a multipolar world. A multipolar world. We confirm that a nuclear war cannot be won. This was enshrined in a joint declaration of the leaders of the U.S. and Russia. However, we wish to recall the trends toward the fate of the strategic stability agreements. 2003 saw Washington take a unilateral step. It abrogated the Soviet-American ABM Treaty. And a similar fate was prepared for other critical strategic agreements. In 2019, it was the U.S. precisely that withdrew from the INF Treaty. And it wasn't Russia, as was mendaciously asserted by the representative of the U.S. Look at these statements from that time. They leave no doubt about who was the initiator of the withdrawal of the INF. If the U.S. has forgotten about that, then we can remind them the consistent steps and about who was the initiator of the destruction of that agreement. Washington set a course to destroy the Open Skies Treaty as well. This course culminated in the unilateral withdrawal from that treaty by the U.S. in 2020. The U.S. has been consistent in violating the provisions of the Treaty on the Further Reduction and Limitation of Strategic Offensive Weapons, the START Treaty. In that regard, Russia decided to suspend the treaty on the 21st of February this year. Washington was not stopped from undermining the critical agreements on the Iranian nuclear program. Even by Resolution 2231, that resolution supported the JCPOA, and the U.S. withdrew from the JCPOA in 2018 unilaterally. As for international agreements on the nonproliferation of WMDs, we wish to recall that the U.S. refused to ratify the CTBT, and it has yet to implement its commitments under the CWC. It is also blocking the strengthening of the BWC regime, blocking the adoption of legally binding protocol on effective verification measures. I'll turn now to the European continent. What happened back in the early 2000s? The U.S. refused to ratify the agreement on the adaptation of the Conventional Forces in Europe agreement, the CFE. In so doing, the U.S. destroyed the foundation of common European security and predictability in the military domain. We will recall what happened in 1999. That year saw the signing of the Charter for European Security. That charter enshrined the principle of indivisible security and a commitment not to strengthen one's own security at the expense of others. However, the ensuing expansion of NATO to the west and the extension of the NATO orbit to Eastern European countries, these steps effectively buried that principle. Finally, we wish to recall to those present what happened in 2021. In that year, we initiated a Russian-American comprehensive dialogue on strategic stability. In the course of that dialogue, we proposed consideration of all security issues. We proposed setting out possible avenues for regulating these issues through political and diplomatic means, including arms control mechanisms. However, our proposals on this front were rejected by the Americans. A similar fate befell the Russian proposals about the establishment of a European security architecture in full compliance with the principles affirmed in the OSCE. Later, there were revolutions by Western politicians. They said that they were never even planning to engage in partnership with our country on equal footing. Those revelations clearly indicate the true nature of the promises they gave at that time. President, as for the objective reasons for the equal footing, those revelations clearly indicate the true nature of the promises they gave at that time. President, as for the objective reasons for the convening of today's meeting, especially the convening on the initiative of the U.S., we see no such reasons. Russia in the 90s undertook all possible efforts to withdraw nuclear weapons from the countries of the former USSR and to bring them onto our territory. Time and again, we called upon the Americans to follow suit. Avidly cited by other speakers in this hall. We also called upon the U.S. to eliminate the relevant infrastructure in Europe and to stop a practice that has continued for many years, a practice that has violated the NPT. The U.S. and other NATO member states have violated it. I'm talking about the joint nuclear sharing missions. We've publicly said that this practice is at odds with the letter and spirit of the nuclear nonproliferation of the NPT. We called upon NATO countries to bring their policies into line with the commitments they had undertaken. We recall that pursuant to Article 1 of the NPT, its member states, the nuclear weapon states that is, undertake not to transfer to anyone whatsoever nuclear weapons or any other nuclear explosive devices, and also not to provide the control over such weapons or explosive devices to anyone, either directly or indirectly. In turn, non-nuclear weapon states, pursuant to Article 2 of the treaty, undertook not to accept from anyone such control, either directly or indirectly. In turn, we are pursuing cooperation with Belarus. We're doing so without violating our international obligations with regard to the nonproliferation of nuclear weapons. President Putin was clear about the fact that we are not transferring nuclear weapons. We're talking about the transfer to Belarus operational tactical missile complexes, Iskander-M missiles. We're talking about the retrofitting of airplanes at the Belarusian airport and the training of teams in the construction of a special storage facility for tactical nuclear weapons on the territory of Belarus, and this will all be under Russian control. under various estimates in the context of cooperation of NATO countries in Europe in the nuclear realm, there might already be deployed around 100 to 150 American tactical nuclear bombs. And the modernization of these stockpiles and the potential delivery systems of nuclear weapons are only gathering steam. The exact locations of the American nuclear weapons have not been unveiled, but there are some reports that they're deployed in the Netherlands, in Belgium, in Italy, Germany, and in Turkey. However, we must remember the heritage of the Cold War. Such storage facilities are deployed on the territory of other states, for example, in Greece. In recent years, we've heard calls to broaden the geography of the storage sites of American nuclear weapons in Europe, to send them to the areas adjoining the allied countries of Russia and Belarus. We recall in October, there was a statement, public statement by the leadership of Poland, that agreement was being reached about the participation of that state in nuclear sharing missions. President, against the backdrop of the openly declared aspirations by NATO to deal Russia a strategic defeat, it is clear that these acts require that we take all requisite measures in response. That includes in the military sphere. We need to do so in order to ensure the security of the allied states of Russia and Belarus. This is precisely the area aimed at with the measures taken by Russia's president that were so scary to the Zelensky regime and his Western backers. Or were you really thinking that we weren't going to respond duly to provocative and aggressive steps? The concerns about global stability from the Western states seem quite hypocritical against the backdrop of their provocative steps taken outside of Europe. Many questions come to light. Not only we're not the only ones with these questions, but other states have them too. The questions that arise due to the U.S., Great Britain, and Australia partnership known as AUKUS and the announced plans to build nuclear submarines. We've said time and again that the creation of this bloc on the whole is stoking tensions. It is undermining efforts to maintain peace and stability in the Asia-Pacific region. It is laying the groundwork for the beginning of a new spiral of an arms race. However, the Americans and their allies, as we are aware, have never been stopped by such considerations. They're worried only about preserving their own geopolitical supremacy. Of course, this supremacy has stopped surprising us a long time ago. The Ukrainian crisis clearly demonstrates that although the interests of Ukrainians themselves have never been taken into consideration by the West, there's one egregious example, a recent example, the decision by London to provide to Kiev armor-piercing rounds with depleted uranium. We know very well about the severe repercussions of the use of these toxic ammunitions for areas where they're used. The victims of the invasion of Western states in Yugoslavia and Iraq have felt the full brunt of these repercussions, and those repercussions continue to reverberate to this date. It would seem that the Kiev regime, that supposedly cares so much about ordinary Ukrainians, should have decisively refused such a gift in order not to jeopardize the safety of the civilian populations and not to contaminate the lands. The representative of the U.S. has said that Russian tanks wouldn't be encountering depleted uranium shells if Russia hadn't committed aggression against the Ukraine. And here I would like to address that. Russian tanks wouldn't be in Ukraine. Ukrainian soldiers wouldn't be dying for foreign political interests if the U.S. and its allies had not undertaken an anti-constitutional coup d'etat in Kiev in 2014. And if Russophobic nationalist Nazis hadn't taken power, and if they hadn't armed that group and prepared them for war against Russia, undermining the Minsk agreements, and if they hadn't covered up their war crimes against the Russian speakers in the east of Ukraine. Ukraine would have known peace a long time ago if the U.S. and its allies weren't pumping the Kiev regime with weapons and weren't forcing it to send thousands of conscripts into battle. The only aim that can justify that's the only aim that the West is pursuing in Ukraine. However, the Kiev authorities are misanthropic and servile toward the West, the same authorities that for many years have shelled these civilians in the Donbass, those authorities are prepared to use Western weapons against their own civilians, and we have known about that for a long time. The indifference to their own population and the European neighbors is fully reflected in the situation surrounding the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Ukraine's military has repeatedly shelled that power plant, despite the risk of a full-fledged disaster on the biggest nuclear power plant in Europe. The Western countries have known about this for a long time too, but they've maintained hypocritical silence on that front. The apotheosis of this hypocrisy was, we could say, the fact that their attempts of the West to call themselves champions of peace against the backdrop of the ongoing flooding of the Kiev regime with weapons. And also Washington and European capitals have said that it's unacceptable to pursue a ceasefire in Ukraine. They have responded in kind to international initiatives to regulate the situation, which Russia supports. Apparently, it doesn't figure into their plans. The West is unprincipled and inconsistent, the collective West, as regards the situation in Ukraine. This clearly illustrates the full essence of the so-called rules-based order. That order has nothing whatsoever to do with international law. In so acting, Western countries are attempting to impose on the rest of the world their self-serving rules, and then to demand that other states unstintingly comply with those rules. As for they themselves, they don't consider themselves bound by any obligations. These are neo-colonial doctrines, in essence, doctrines aimed at ensuring the flourishing at any price of the so-called golden billion. As for us and our colleagues from developing states, these doctrines cannot fool us. They are mendacious, they are unconvincing, as are the attempts to shift onto Russia the blame for the undermining of strategic stability. The sooner the collective West understands that and embarks on a serious dialogue on equal footing on principles of global and European indivisible security, the more chances we will have to avoid new pressing problems and crises. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I would like to thank High Representative Izumi Nakamitsu for her briefing. Mr. President, last year, during the 10th Review Conference of the NPT, we found ourselves often repeating that we were disappointed with the lack of ambition in the goals set for nuclear disarmament. Several times, we were told by nuclear weapon states that the best we could hope for was to confirm existing disarmament commitments in order to prevent backsliding in nuclear disarmament. Since then, we have failed to meet even this extremely low bar. By now, it seems clear that nuclear disarmament has gone into reverse. All nuclear weapon states are upgrading their arsenals, either quantitatively or qualitatively, or both. In addition, they are developing new means of delivery. Coupled with an accelerating global missile race from East Asia to the Middle East to Eastern Europe, it is no exaggeration to say that nuclear risks are at their highest levels since the Cold War. Even more worrisome, compared to that period, we now have more actors involved with more delivery systems and fewer rules in place. Mr. President, when Brazil ratified the NPT in 1998, our Parliament expressed the understanding that the decision to join the treaty was inextricably linked to the fulfillment of Article 6 disarmament obligations, and I stress the word obligations, by nuclear weapon states. This treaty can only be seen as legitimate when all parties comply in good faith with all of their obligations. The treaty does not set any preconditions for disarmament, nor does it say that disarmament shall be contingent on the security environment. On the contrary, it is our view that it is disarmament that shapes the security environment and not the other way around. Yet Article 6 is not the only article of the NPT that has not been fully observed. Brazil has long maintained that any nuclear sharing arrangement is inconsistent with both Articles 1 and 2 of the NPT. We are not persuaded by arguments that seek to carve loopholes around NPT language, such as those suggesting that as long as there is no handover of command and control of the weapons, nuclear sharing arrangements would not constitute a transfer, or that the pre-existing arrangements that were not in line with the provisions of the NPT could be grandfathered into the treaty, among others. The text of these articles is clear, and their intent is clearer. We take both these articles very seriously, and we have long opposed any nuclear sharing arrangements. While we have expressed our concerns about NATO's nuclear sharing arrangements, we also stress that two wrongs do not make a right. Reacting to a nuclear sharing arrangement or to any other perceived nuclear threat by the placement of weapons in a non-nuclear weapon state also constitutes a breach of NPT obligations. Mr. President, responding to violations with violations seems to have become the prevailing logic in arms control today. Over the course of the past year, we have seen countless disappointing incidents where withdrawals or suspensions of obligations on one side were answered with tit-for-tat withdrawals or suspensions of obligations by the other side. We have seen it with the INF Treaty, with the Open Skies Treaty, and more recently with New START. This is a race to the bottom that makes nobody safer, regardless of who made the first move. By cutting down channels of communication, increasing uncertainty, and reducing trust, the world is being made less secure for nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states alike. The backsliding on nuclear disarmament must stop before it renders the NPT a dead letter. I urge all of us in this Council, and especially the nuclear weapon states, to recommit to arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation, and to live up to all of their NPT obligations. Mr. President, in other areas of international law, a suspension of obligations may at times be the appropriate response to a treaty violation. In the nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation areas, it should never be. First, because that suspension in itself may violate the NPT's Article 6 obligation to curb arms racing and engage in disarmament. But secondly, and perhaps more importantly, because the risks in this area are higher than those in almost any other area. Tit-for-tat breaches of obligations in nuclear arms control and disarmament threaten to set off unpredictable processes of arms racing that greatly increase the risks of voluntary and involuntary escalation. Violations, be they nuclear sharing arrangements or breaches of other treaties, must be answered with concerted efforts to remedy the breach and to bring all parties back into full compliance. Let us step back from the brink and do what we must. All parties must re-establish dialogue, restore existing arms control and disarmament mechanisms, and work towards new ones that will permit them to fully comply with all their NPT obligations. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Brazil for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Señor Presidente.
Mr. President, we're grateful for your decision to convene this meeting at the request of Ukraine, and we are also grateful for the briefing by the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, Izumi Nakamitsu. The historical position of Ecuador is well known, that there are no safe hands for nuclear weapons, because their very existence is a challenge to the survival of humanity and entails grave concerns and humanitarian consequences. And the only way to resolve them is by the complete elimination of these weapons. Now, just a few days after the start of the military aggression against Ukraine, and specifically on the 1st of March of last year, 13 countries active in efforts in disarmament and nuclear non-proliferation, including Ecuador, issued a joint communique condemning the orders that were given at the time by the Russian Federation to put on maximum alert its nuclear deterrence forces. And we made an appeal to this country to undertake urgent actions to achieve nuclear détente. Today, we regret that a year later, the narrative and the actions of the Russian Federation, instead of alleviating global concerns, have continued escalating. And we urge that an end be put to any measure that involves a nuclear threat, taking into account the consequences that this could have for the region and the world, especially any misinterpretation or miscalculation. We also regret the announcement by this past February, to suspend its participation in the Strategic Weapons Reduction Treaty, New START, and we urge it to return to its obligations in the framework of the international security architecture. Ecuador, as a party to the first densely populated region free of nuclear weapons established under the Tlatelolco Treaty, and as a state party to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, considers that any deployment of these weapons is a violation of international law. For this reason we reject nuclear weapons wherever they are, and we reject their modernization. We also deplore that 4 days after the beginning of the military aggression against Ukraine, Belarus organized a referendum to remove from its constitution its status as a nation free of nuclear weapons, and now it is seeking to accept the deployment of tactical nuclear weapons on its territory in violations of the international non-proliferation architecture. We also condemn in the strongest terms the announcement by the Russian Federation of its intention to deploy tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus at the expense of its international obligations in this sphere, which is even more alarming in the context of the military aggression that is continuing against Ukraine. These actions and Russia's narrative fuel the risk of a nuclear war. We call for a de-escalation to reduce these risks and avoid any accident. Once again, we would insist that the Russian Federation put an end to this invasion and to return to legality, honoring the security guarantees with regard to the accession by Ukraine to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. Lastly, this Council should be guided by the joint declaration of China, France, United Kingdom, United States, and Russia itself that was made on the 3rd of January of 2022 on the prevention of nuclear war and the importance of avoiding an arms race. And in that declaration, they stated, as we have heard in every single language, that a nuclear war cannot be won and should never be fought. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Mr. President, I'd like to thank High Representative Nakamitsu for her informative briefing. The conflict in Ukraine has shattered the lives of its citizens and heightened geopolitical tensions to levels not seen since the Cold War era. The countless lives lost and the worsening humanitarian crisis underscores the urgent need for de-escalation. These same realities also call for a re-evaluation of actions that may further exacerbate tensions. The war has forced the international community to confront the dangers and complexities associated with nuclear weapons, inactive nuclear material, and armed conflict at and near the site of a nuclear power plant. The international community has deep concerns about the potential for accidents and miscalculation amidst growing tensions and intensifying conflict. On their own, such activities pose significant risks. Taken together, they perpetuate a dangerously escalatory cycle with potentially unfathomable repercussions. Accordingly, responsible states need not limit themselves to parsing the legality of each individual action when it is the sum total of these actions that brings us ever closer to a nuclear catastrophe. We must exercise prudence and caution. 60 years ago, the world waited with bated breath as the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. The leaders of the countries involved took the decision to engage in dialogue to resolve the standoff. These decisions also created the conditions for the signing of the world's first nuclear treaty. Even today, we know dialogue remains possible. Russia and Ukraine's recent agreement to extend the Black Sea Grain Initiative illustrates the benefits of such dialogue. The United Arab Emirates reiterates its gratitude to the UN Secretary General and Turkey for their tireless efforts. We encourage this same spirit to drive more focused diplomacy in other vital areas, most critically, nuclear safety and security. The UAE stands ready to support such endeavors. Mr. President, to go beyond efforts to mitigate the war's impact and to achieve a sustainable and just peace in Ukraine, we must begin to lay the foundations for the conflict's resolution. While the Council regularly convenes to address the situation in Ukraine, the only certain way to halt this escalation and prevent tragedy is to find an end to this war. The risks that have us convening today testify to the international community's urgent interest in that outcome. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président,
President, France condemns the agreement entered into between Russia and Belarus to deploy nuclear weapons to Belarus. This is one more blow dealt by Russia to the arms control architecture. It is a blow to strategic stability in Europe and to international peace and security. Since 2018, Russia has violated the INF Treaty, which directly led to its collapse, and it suspended its participation in the New START Treaty last February. We call upon Russia to revisit that decision. Russia has resorted several times to aggressive and irresponsible nuclear rhetoric. In announcing its intent to deploy nuclear weapons outside its borders, it is contravening once more its international commitments, in particular the commitments under the Budapest Memorandum. It is also aggravating an already unstable situation. President, France reaffirms the importance it attaches to the respect of the declaration made by the P5 on the 3rd of January 2022, a declaration backed by Vladimir Putin. That declaration was on the prevention of nuclear war and an arms race. We recall that Russia reiterated its commitment in a joint declaration signed together with China, signed on the 21st of March, which that's just a little over a week ago, which stipulated that all states, all nuclear weapon states, must refrain from deploying nuclear weapons abroad. That was a quote that was 9 days ago from President Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. France calls upon Russia to show responsibility expected of a nuclear weapon state. And the aims of nuclear weapons are defensive purposes, deterrence, and prevention of war. It's unacceptable that the threat of those weapons is brought to bear by Russia to coerce Ukraine in the context of a war of aggression. France will continue to support Ukraine to allow it to defend its sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. We condemn the use of Belarusian territory as a rear base and as a launching pad for Russian strikes on civilian infrastructure of Ukraine. We call upon the regime of Belarus not to take one more step toward escalation and to reconsider its decision to accept the deployment of nuclear weapons on its territory.
Representative of France for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank U.S. Nakamitsu for her briefing. Mr. President, we have consistently called on Russia to stop its aggression against Ukraine, which is a violation of the UN Charter and international law. Last month, an overwhelming majority of the UN General Assembly called for a halt to this aggression. However, Russia ignores the voices of the international community and continues its aggression, and Japan condemns the remarks by President Putin about Russia's decision to deploy tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus, which further increases the tension while Russia continues its aggression against Ukraine. Russia also abuses its status as nuclear weapon state with its irresponsible rhetoric. Japan can never accept Russia's nuclear threats, let alone any use of nuclear weapons. Other member states should also refrain from supporting such actions, either directly or indirectly. In February, Russia also announced a suspension of implementation of the New START treaty. Japan deeply regrets Russia's decision and calls on Russia to end its suspension of the treaty and return immediately to full implementation of the treaty. Mr. President, as the only country that has ever suffered atomic bombings during war, Japan is strongly committed to leading international efforts toward a world without nuclear weapons, including the annual General Assembly resolution on the elimination of the nuclear weapons. It is regrettable that the final document of the 10th NPT Review Conference was not adopted due to the objection of only one country. It is all the more so in view of the declaration issued January 2022 by 5 permanent members of the Council, including Russia. Japan condemns Russia's threat to use nuclear weapons as a serious and unacceptable menace to the peace and security of the international community. The record of 77 years of non-use of nuclear weapons must not be broken by Russia. All of us here need to renew our commitment to working together in order to maintain and strengthen the NPT regime and to promote nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation, as well as arms control. Mr. President, Japan urges Russia and Belarus to cease any actions that may increase tensions. And Japan once again stresses that Russia must immediately stop its war of aggression, withdraw all of its troops and military equipment from Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Mozambique. I wish to thank Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu, the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, for their important briefing. I recognize and welcome in the chamber the presence of the distinguished permanent representatives of Belarus, Estonia, Poland, Ukraine, and the European Union. The distinguished council members, from the very start of this conflict, Mozambique has been consistently alerting to the risk of strategic miscalculation and to the potential of the war to escalate into a wider and more dangerous ramifications. We have been following with concern the numerous developments which pose serious risks to the tenets of the international non-proliferation regime. As we deliberate on this matter, I wish to draw your attention to the example set by the African continent in promoting a nuclear-free world and efforts towards creating zones of peace on the continent. In this connection, African states have adopted the Treaty of Pelindaba that establishes Africa as a nuclear weapons-free zone. Thus, our continent does not possess nuclear weapons, and it is committed to preserve such a status. This landmark initiative continues to serve as an example that other regions could emulate from, fostering a safer and more secure international community. Let us be clear, a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. We therefore call upon all parties involved to engage in constructive dialogue and to work together to find peaceful solutions to their security concerns in line with the principles and objectives of the United Nations Charter, which, among other things, prohibits the use or threat of force in international relations. The international community must stand united in its commitment to nuclear disarmament, non-proliferation, and the promotion of peace and security worldwide. There is simply no other civilized and peaceful options available to us. I thank you. I now resume my function as President of the Council. The representative of the United States has asked for the floor to make a further statement.
President, I apologize for taking the floor, but I need to respond to some charges that were leveled against the United States by the representative of the Russian Federation. Frankly, there are too many ridiculous charges to respond to. Russia has totally distorted the facts surrounding the unfortunate demise of several treaties, but I will address just a couple of issues that I think are fundamentally important and that were raised. The INF Treaty. Back in 2013, the U.S. engaged Russia and made clear that we had evidence that Russia was in violation of the INF Treaty through the deployment of a non-INF range missile called the 9M729. Russia denied the existence of this missile. We worked very hard over the years, myself and a number of my colleagues, to try to convince Russia to come back into compliance with the INF Treaty. In 2017, Russia finally admitted the existence of this missile, but said it was not outside of the INF Treaty range. After much deliberation internally and with allies, we decided that Russia, the U.S. ruled Russia was in material breach of the INF Treaty, and therefore we subsequently took a step to withdraw from the treaty, which was extremely unfortunate, but we felt we had no choice to do that, but to do that. So just wanted to make sure the record was clear on that. With regard to the issue of nuclear sharing, this is an issue that was discussed, as High Representative mentioned, back in the negotiations in the late 60s with regard to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Russia at no time fundamentally objected to the arrangements that NATO had already had in existence. It signed and ratified the treaty. It was only after its invasion of Crimea that it decided to look for a reason to get out of the treaty or to at least accuse the U.S. of, in essence, violating the NPT. And so for 3 decades, almost close to 4 decades, we heard nothing from Russia about nuclear sharing. So it is quite strange how, after all those years, Russia decided Russia had no problems with it until after Crimea. So I want to be clear about this issue of nuclear sharing because it's quite important. This issue of NATO nuclear sharing, as I said, was an issue that was discussed at the negotiations of the NPT. The U.S. has not and will not violate the NPT. We are in full compliance with our obligations under the NPT, including Article 6 that was raised here. Any suggestions that the United States is in violation of that treaty are just patently false. And the countries that raise that issue need to read the NPT, read the negotiating history of the NPT. I have several times read it. So I fundamentally reject that charge. My last point, Mr. President, is that we're here to address specifically Russia's deployment or planned deployment of nuclear weapons in Belarus. This is a fundamental threat to international peace and security. And our Russian colleague has not explained in full what is going on with this potential deployment. And we call on Russia to adhere to its international obligations with regard to arms control. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. The representative of the Russian Federation has asked for the floor to make a further statement.
Mr. President, we don't intend to transform this meeting into a dialogue between Russia and the United States, but I would like to say a few things. First of all, I want to thank the representative of the United States that, unlike what he said in his official statement, recognized that it was precisely the United States that withdrew from the INF in 2019. This is a fact. This is a confirmation that we've just heard. We will send a letter to the members of the Security Council and describe the sequence of steps which took place at the time, who did what, who was the initiator, on what basis, what grounds. I simply want to quote one declaration on the 23rd of January of 2019. The Minister of Defense and Foreign Minister has invited foreign military attachés and journalists to a meeting where certain technical characteristics of land-based cruise missiles were demonstrated and launch vehicles were demonstrated, etc. The representative of the United States and the military representatives of a whole number of other states ignored this invitation. The official representative of the U.S. Embassy in Moscow told Interfax, a Russian information agency, that the United States and most of our NATO allies refused to attend this briefing, in which we all saw just another example, another attempt to conceal the violations and create an appearance of transparency. And then President Trump declared about withdrawal. Then I have a question to my American colleague. Can he confirm or deny that American nuclear weapons is not only on its national territory, but also on the territory of Europe? Can you confirm that or deny that? Maybe he will dare to answer that question. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. President. Distinguished members of the Security Council Under Secretary General Nakamitsu. Ukraine has requested this meeting following the latest statement by the Russian Federation regarding its intent to station tactical nuclear weapons on the territory of Belarus, a non-nuclear weapon state according to the NPT. It is yet another provocative step by Putin's criminal regime that undermines basic principles of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the architecture of nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation, as well as the international security system as a whole. Such intents cannot but cause particular concern for the entire international community as Russia delivers such statements against the backdrop of its unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine. The nuclear blackmail is one of the tools that Russia has exploited since the very beginning of the invasion. In addition, the shelling and seizure of Ukrainian nuclear facilities that have also aggravated the nuclear threats at the global level. Today is the 401st day of the full-fledged war, and Russia demonstrates its failure to prevail on the battlefield. In a desperate attempt to avoid the unavoidable, its military defeat in Ukraine, Russia again resorts to waving its nuclear bludgeon. The Kremlin is ready to undermine the entire architecture of nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. The Kremlin is ready to threaten the world with nuclear apocalypse, as one of Putin's cronies recently said. What the Kremlin is not ready is to hold its violations of the UN Charter and to return to the tenets of international law. Mr. President, the above announcement has provided us with yet another solid proof that papers that Putin signs mean nothing to him. Putin prepared for the invasion of Ukraine while signing in January 2022 the joint statement of the leaders of 5 nuclear weapon states on preventing nuclear war and avoiding arms races. In less than 2 months thereafter, Putin committed, along with four other leaders, to the reduction of strategic risks. He waged a war the European continent have not seen since the end of the Second World War. It took only 4 days for Putin to violate another pledge that he recently made with the President of the People's Republic of China in the joint statement on deepening the comprehensive strategic partnership of coordination for the new era, signed on 22nd of March 2023. The document declares that all nuclear weapon states should refrain from deploying nuclear weapons outside their national territories. To the credit of the Chinese side reminded to Moscow in a very sensible manner that the nuclear war cannot be won and fought, and that nuclear proliferation must be prevented. Unlike Russia's, the Chinese side's position on nuclear weapons is firm and clear. Let me also recall that Russia was the only country to block the consensus on the final document of the 10th Review Conference of the Treaties to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons in August last year. Last month, Russia announced its decision to suspend its participation in the New START Treaty, one of the pillars of arms control architecture. The Kremlin lies to and disregards even those whom they declare their friends and strategic partners. This fact speaks volumes about Russia's readiness to meaningfully and responsibly engage in the de-escalation process and peace efforts. Instead, Russia consolidates its disinformation and creates fake pretexts for nuclear escalation. Following earlier fakes about dirty bombs, this time they simply explored the certain resemblance in names of components of weapons of mass destruction and of conventional munitions and made an unprecedented contribution in the field of nuclear disarmament by joining the NPT and signing the 1994 Budapest Memorandum on providing security assurances in connection with Ukraine's accession to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. Ukraine abandoned the world's third largest nuclear arsenal. However, one of the signatories of the memorandum, the Russian Federation, has failed to fulfill its obligations under the Budapest Memorandum. Now, this country demonstrates again that it perceives nuclear weapons to be a tool of threats and intimidation, not a mean of deterrence and prevention of war. It is therefore critically important for all responsible nations not to fall for the Russian nuclear saber-rattling and to consolidate the joint and decisive actions to ensure reliable deterrence and prevent further erosion of the nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation architecture by Russia. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Belarus.
Thank you, President. Belarus is a consistent advocate of processes of nuclear disarmament and nonproliferation. The contribution of Belarus in global nuclear disarmament is clear and indisputable. Its significance has been time and again affirmed in many documents agreed upon at the multilateral and bilateral levels. In 1993, Belarus made a conscious choice, a choice to renounce nuclear weapons, and it joined the Non-Proliferation Treaty. In so doing, it became the first state in the post-Soviet space to voluntarily refuse the possible possession of nuclear weapons without any preconditions and without any reservations. In December 1994, the US, Russia, and Great Britain signed the Memorandum on Security Guarantees in connection with the accession by the Republic of Belarus to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Those countries undertook to guarantee the territorial integrity and the sovereignty of Belarus. They also committed to refrain from any measures of political and economic coercion. For a long time now, Belarus has been subject to unprecedented political, economic, financial, and informational pressure. This fact directly violates the provisions of the Budapest Memorandum, the memorandum that so frequently has been mentioned here. Trade, visa, banking, and other bans and restrictions have been introduced against the government, against legal persons and natural persons in Belarus. These restrictions and bans have come from the US, the Great Britain, and their NATO allies, as well as from European Union states. These bans and limitations amount to a direct, gross interference into the domestic affairs of a sovereign state. They have a clear aim to change the geopolitical course of a country and to change the domestic political configuration in Belarus. Unilateral coercive measures in politics and in the economy are accompanied by the ramping up on the territory of neighboring NATO member states, neighboring us that is, ramping up a military capacity in the direct proximity of Belarus. Considering these circumstances and the legitimate concerns arising from them, concerns about risk of national security, Belarus has consistently and transparently for its neighbors in the international community, has taken on actions, compelled actions to develop its own defensive capacity. These actions are exclusively aimed at a response, and they're aimed at shoring up our own security and defensive capacity. The cooperation of the Republic of Belarus with the Russian Federation, which is its main military and political ally, cooperation toward increasing our defensive capacity and national security, that cooperation is carried out in stringent compliance with international law. There is training by Russia of Belarusian pilots that are able to operate airplanes that can carry certain ammunitions, and the modernization of these flights, as well as the possible, I stress that word, the possible deployment of tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus. These things are also exclusively a compelled reaction to the challenges and risks to national security that are facing Belarus. These measures are undertaken in strict compliance with the provisions of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. The control over the nuclear weapons as well as technologies will remain with the Russians. According to the NPT, states that have nuclear weapons should not transfer those nuclear weapons to anyone. They should not transfer the control over those weapons. And non-nuclear weapon states cannot accept nuclear weapons or the control over these weapons. Just today, just a few hours ago, there was a statement made. It was a statement made by the president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko. He was speaking to the people of Belarus and to the National Assembly, to the parliament of Belarus, that is. In that statement, the president of Belarus was frank and very detailed in answering all of the questions that had to do with, inter alia, the plans to strengthen the security and defensive capacity of Belarus. In his statement, President Lukashenko underscored that this was not blackmailing or intimidation. Belarus is not prepared to attack anyone first, but rather is responding appropriately using all existing capacity, responding to any foreign aggression, that is. This cooperation between Russia and Belarus is nothing new. It's nothing new when it comes to military cooperation between non-nuclear and nuclear weapon states carried out in the context of the NPT, and much has been spoken about that today in this hall. In NATO, as everyone knows very well, and we've heard a lot about that, NATO is carrying out so-called nuclear sharing missions. You know perfectly well that a number of airplanes of member states of the alliance are certified to carry out flights with nuclear weapons, and training is underway, training of crews to carry out these missions. Joint exercises are undertaken too. Moreover, on the territory of an entire range of European members of NATO, such as Belgium, Germany, the Netherlands, Italy, and Turkey. In these states, there are some 150 units of tactical nuclear weapons from the U.S., and over 250 flights have been prepared to possibly use those weapons. Belarus is a staunch proponent of constructive and respectful dialogue aimed at strengthening regional and global security alike, aimed at multilateral mechanisms for disarmament, non-proliferation, and arms control, including in the nuclear realm. The convening of such broad multilateral dialogue in the spirit of San Francisco has been repeatedly and publicly called for by the Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko. We are grateful to Ukraine for submitting this question for discussion at the Security Council. It is our position that the Security Council and the whole of the international community need to finally pay very meticulous attention to what is generally posing a threat, that is the nuclear sharing missions of NATO and the deploying by the U.S. of nuclear weapons outside its national borders. We call upon Ukraine not to stop halfway and to be bold and courageous in asking NATO to stop the practice of nuclear sharing missions. And we call upon the U.S. to take its weapons out of Belgium, Germany, the Netherlands, Italy, and Turkey, which, to use the phrase used by Ukraine in some statements here, these areas should be viewed as occupied countries or countries that are held hostage. Incidentally, we could ask Ukraine we could ask them to convene a meeting to look into this issue and possibly to take the appropriate decisions. We would like to address everyone else who wishes to resolve the human rights problems that supposedly exist in Belarus. We have an invitation for you. First, you should handle your own problems in your own countries. For example, you should address the problems of pensioners, current and future. You should address the problems of presidents, current and past, and maybe future presidents. And we've repeatedly said, we'll repeat it here, that you shouldn't meddle in our domestic affairs. You should deal with your own countries and real human rights problems, life and dignity, health, security. And you shouldn't even attempt to muse about the desires of the Belarusian people when the Belarusian people are taking important domestic policy decisions in their country. You have no inkling of an idea about what the Belarusian people really thinks. Now let's turn to the proliferation, or rather the circulation by Albania of a document to the Security Council. That was also mentioned. If you want to transform the archive of the Security Council into a garbage can, then you have the right to do so. You're submitting documents of private persons. Those persons don't represent anybody except for themselves. And these people are completely financed by you, by Western sponsors. And maybe it's time for the taxpayers of these countries to show some interest in what their governments are doing. Maybe it's time they ask what sums of money are spent on the so-called Belarusian opposition. Who specifically is paying for this? From what sources? And why? Apparently, why are you so rich, evidently, that you can spend such sums of money on the citizens of Belarus rather than addressing your own problems in your own countries? By the way, that's another glaring example of, yes, pardon me. Yes, there's something else that we were just thinking of. We could give Albania, for example, we could show her we could talk to some grandma sitting in her courtyard about issues of international security. And I will tell you that this document will be of no less value than the documents you've submitted. Maybe it will be even more valuable. And we'd like to repeat another great example of how about how a fully dependent state behaves in the Security Council. This is another reminder to all the member states of the UN, a reminder about how attentively you need to approach your decisions when voting on members to the Security Council, that is the non-permanent members of the Security Council. In this regard, I wish to recall that the Security Council elections are coming up in June of this year. And there's something artificially created. I'm referring to political competition in the Eastern European group. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Belarus for their statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Olof Skog, Head of Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Good morning, colleagues. I will address the Security Council on behalf of the EU and its member states. In addition, the candidate countries North Macedonia, Montenegro, Ukraine, Republic of Moldova, and Bosnia-Herzegovina, as well as the potential candidate country Georgia, and Liechtenstein, Andorra, Monaco, and San Marino all align themselves with this statement. Mr. President, the EU condemns the announcement by Russia on 25th of March of its intention to deploy nuclear weapons on the territory of Belarus, and that an agreement has been reached with Belarus to this end. This announcement, part of continued reckless nuclear rhetoric by Russia, constitutes yet another irresponsible step, escalating an already tense situation in view of Russia's illegal and unjustified war of aggression against Ukraine. Just 1 month ago, the General Assembly adopted a resolution on a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine, calling on all member states to cooperate in the spirit of solidarity to address the global impacts of the war, including on nuclear security and safety. The Belarusian regime is an accomplice in Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. The deletion of Belarus's declared stance as a non-nuclear territory from the revised constitution adopted last year was a worrying development. The announcement of last week that Russia intends to deploy nuclear weapons on Belarusian territory would be yet another dangerous step. Threats with and use of nuclear weapons are inadmissible. Russia's decision will not weaken our resolve to support Ukraine. However, Belarus can still make the choice to decline to host Russian nuclear weapons. We therefore call on the Belarus authorities to put an immediate stop to their support of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine and reverse any decision that would only contribute to heightening tensions in the region. Mr. President, on December 5, 1994, as has been reminded here, the three depositories of the NPT, including Russia, signed the Budapest Memorandum with Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, respectively, upon their accession to the NPT. Besides the reaffirmation of the commitments by the depositories, including by Russia to, and I quote, respect the independence and sovereignty and the existing borders, end of quote, of Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, and to refrain from threat or use of force against their territorial integrity or political independence. The memorandum also takes into account the commitments by the three states joining the NPT, including notably Belarus, to, and I quote, eliminate all nuclear weapons from their territory, end of quote. Let me recall that a little more than 1 year ago, on January 3, 2022, Russia signed up to the joint statement by the nuclear weapon states in the NPT, reaffirming that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. Furthermore, it reiterated this commitment just 3 days before its 25th March announcement in the 22nd March joint statement with China. Through its unacceptable and dangerous nuclear rhetoric, by regularly alluding to the use of nuclear weapons in a war of aggression, it has itself started and coupled with the 25th March announcement on deploying nuclear weapons on the territory of Belarus, Russia acts in stark contradiction to the commitments of which it has undertaken to be a guardian. This announced step also runs counter to the commitment of Belarus taken into account in the Budapest Memorandum to eliminate all nuclear weapons from its territory. Therefore, the EU calls on Russia and on Belarus to reverse this decision and to abide by all their aforementioned commitments. The EU also calls on Russia to resume the implementation of New START. The EU and its member states will continue to monitor the situation closely in coordination with all our partners. I thank you, Mr. President, and I also want to thank you, being your last day on the Council, to congratulate you and Mozambique for a very successful presidency. Thank you very much.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Skog for his statement and for the kind words addressed to Mozambique and our presidency. I now give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Mr. President, let me start by thanking you for providing Poland with the opportunity to address the Security Council today on a topic of enormous importance for our country, the region of Central Europe, and in fact, the whole world. Before I deliver my remarks, however, first I wish to congratulate you on the successful conduct of Mozambique's presidency in the Council during the month of March, and I thank High Representative Izumi Nakamitsu for the briefing. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Council, Poland consequently anchors its foreign policy on the need for assuring peace and security in our region. We want the region to be secure, stable, where all nations are able to make their free choices, both regarding their domestic and foreign policies. We want the region free of domination, suppression, and external threats. Therefore, Poland notes with a serious concern Russia's announced plans to deploy tactical nuclear weapons and their means of delivery to Belarus. Such a decision would constitute an irresponsible escalation and would only further increase the ongoing tensions in Europe stemming from Russia's aggression against Ukraine. It would also pose a major risk to the integrity of the global non-proliferation system. The international community needs to categorically condemn Russia's nuclear rhetoric, which is extremely dangerous and highly irresponsible. Moscow's strategy, echoed today by Alexander Lukashenko, is clear: to intimidate, to provoke, to impede efforts aimed at ending Russia's war on Ukraine. It is clearly a rhetoric of confrontation. It undermines efforts to find any successful peace formula, moving away from proposals, including those made by the members of this Council. Here we also want to attract Council members' attention to Russia's continued efforts to fully subordinate Belarus, both politically and militarily, and to further instrumentalize Minsk in pursuing Moscow's aggressive policy. Poland has raised the issue of Belarus' culpability on several occasions in this chamber. It is deplorable that the authorities in Minsk chose to act as an enabler to Russia's illegal war in Ukraine in the first place. It is unacceptable that now it is decided to further pursue in this role to the detriment of the security of us all. Mr. President, Russia has constantly broken its arms control commitments. One of the most recent acts was the suspension of its participation in the New START treaty. But we must not forget that the collapse of the INF Treaty in 2019 occurred also due to Russia's decision. The international community would desperately wish to see a return to compliance and acting in good faith. But instead, we are served with the announcement of yet another escalatory measure. Repeated threats to use of nuclear weapons are utterly irresponsible and unacceptable, even if they boil down to a political bluff of blackmailing. It was only over a year ago, in January 22, that Moscow joined the other permanent members of this Council in adopting a statement saying that the nuclear war can never be won and should never be fought, and it was the fact that has been recalled by many delegations today. The sad reality we find ourselves in today is the best manifestation of Russia's contempt for its own commitments to global peace and to the principles that should bind us all as members of this organization. Mr. President, to conclude, Poland would like to call on Russia and Belarus to refrain from pursuing the announced plans and comply with their international commitments. We also appeal to all states to redouble their efforts aimed at the strengthening of the non-proliferation system, despite Russian irresponsible policy and aggressive behavior. Those actions must not work. The risk of nuclear apocalypse in the region and in the world must be averted. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Poland for their statement and also for the kind words addressed to the presidency of Mozambique. I now give the floor to the representative of Estonia.
Mr. President, I'm speaking on behalf of the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and my own country, Estonia. I thank the High Representative Izumi Nakamitsu for her briefing, as well as the Presidency for the opportunity to address the Council. Little more than a year ago, Russia signed up to the joint P5 statement, reaffirming that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. Last week, Russia reaffirmed this in the joint statement with China and further committed to reduce the risk of nuclear war and these tensions. Just a couple of days later, the masks were off again. Russia resorted again to a dangerous and irresponsible nuclear rhetoric by revealing its alleged plan to deploy nuclear weapons to Belarus. This latest statement signals the desperation Moscow is facing in the battlefield while pursuing its unprovoked and unjustified aggression against Ukraine. Under the threat of nuclear escalation, the Kremlin is hoping to deter Ukraine from exercising its inherent right to self-defense. It hopes to intimidate countries from helping Ukraine. Our response to Russia's actions is clear and simple. The nuclear blackmail does not work. We will not be intimidated nor deterred. We will continue to support Ukraine as long as it takes, as long as Russia has withdrawn all of its forces from the territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Mr. President, Russia's statement proves once again how unreliable, untrustworthy, and worthless are Russia's commitments to its partners, as well as to the international community. In 1994, Ukraine gave up its nuclear arsenal in return to assurances given inter alia by Russia to respect the independence and sovereignty of Ukraine and to refrain from threat or use of force against its territorial integrity. Russia blatantly violated the Budapest Memorandum as well as the UN Charter by occupying Crimea in 2014. Since then, we have watched on how Russia has embarked on systematically undermining international arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation framework. It is time for the international community to recognize this destructive pattern of Russia and stand against it firmly. The suspension of a New START treaty is a recent example of Russia's reckless behavior to undermine nuclear stability. We urge Russia to revert this decision and abide by all of its commitments and to return to full compliance with the New START treaty. Mr. President, Belarus has been supporting Russia's aggression against Ukraine since the full-scale invasion started in February 22. We note with regret that Belarus, under the regime of Lukashenko, is increasingly losing its sovereignty and is more and more integrated into Russia's military plans. We urge Belarus to stop acting as an enabler to Russia's illegal war in Ukraine. We urge the Lukashenko's regime to stop being accomplice to Russia's desperate moves to threaten its neighbors and destabilize Europe. We also urge and support the Belarusian democratic movement and civil society to continue standing up for a free, independent, and democratic Belarus and prevent their country from becoming another victim of Russia's imperial ambitions. Mr. President, finally, isn't it telling that tomorrow, on the anniversary of Bucha massacre, Russia will assume the presidency of UN Security Council? This is shameful, humiliating, and dangerous to the credibility and effective functioning of this body. A country that fights a war of aggression against its neighbor, commits most horrendous atrocities, threatens the world with nuclear weapons, and whose leader is a war criminal with a standing arrest warrant from the ICC should have no place in leading a body that's primary response or purpose is preserving international peace and security. It is up to the responsible members of this body to counter Russia's attempts to transform the primary venue of international diplomacy into a mockery and a platform of disinformation. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Estonia for their statement. No. Well, there are no more names inscribed on my list of speakers. Well, this is the last scheduled meeting of the Council for the month of March. Therefore, before adjourning the meeting, I would like to express the profound and sincere appreciation and thanks of Mozambique to the members of the Council and to the Secretariat of the Council for your support and your cooperation in our task of presiding over this important body. And this task is not very easy. March has been a busy month and one in which we were able to rally to consensus on several important issues within our purview. The presence of the President of the Republic of Mozambique in this chamber for 2 days bears testimony to the importance, high importance we attach to this body designed by the Charter of the United Nations. We understand that we made some progress in our common determination to bring about peace and security in the world. I'm bound to say that we could not do it alone, of course, and without the hard work, support, and the positive contributions of every delegation and the representatives of the Secretariat. And this includes technical support team, conference service officers, interpreters, verbatim reporters, and security staff. So as we end our presidency, I know I speak on behalf of the Council in wishing our colleague Ambassador Vasily left, in wishing the Russian Federation good luck in the month of April. They will know how, even though they are permanent members of the Security Council, this city is always very difficult. And I thank you very much for your cooperation. This meeting stands adjourned.